Welcome to Salem Week in Review. We're continuing our look at the gubernatorial race this week with an interview with the Libertarian candidate for governor, Richard Burke. Welcome.
Hi.
I want to start our half an hour together by just asking you to just tell me why voters should be interested in voting for you as opposed to what's considered the major party candidates, Republican Bill Sizemore, Democrat Governor John Kitzhaber.
Well, in short, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And what you have in John Kitzhaber and Bill Sizemore is one of two choices. If you vote for John Kitzhaber, you have a candidate that's going to raise your taxes and increase regulation in your businesses and your financial affairs. If you vote for Bill Sizemore, you'll vote for somebody who wants to use government to interfere with your personal life. For example, the Death with Dignity bill, which he opposes, the abortion issues, which he opposes. He wants to use government to affect your personal life. I, as a libertarian, don't want to do either of these things. We do need government to protect us and protect our property and our children, but I want government out of your pocketbook as much as possible and out of your private life too. And I'm the only candidate that offers that choice.
So you are saying that basically on social issues you're more liberal, on fiscal issues you're more conservative.
Basically. However, although we think you should have the ability to make choices about your private life, we don't think that others should be forced to pay for them. So in that sense, we're not socially liberal. So we like to use the term socially tolerant. Socially tolerant. Fiscally conservative, socially tolerant.
Okay. Let's start with fiscally conservative. Okay. Mm-hmm. You are the only candidate thus far that has issued a budget to say what you would spend money on, what you would cut money on. Tell me some of the highlights of that. How does your budget differ, for example, from what the legislature passed in the 1997 session?
Well, what we started with was John Kitzhaber's recommended 1997-99 budget. And actually what the legislature approved was only a few $1 million off that, so it's essentially the same thing. We did is we went down every point and we looked at what government did and said, is this something that government needs to be doing? Is this something that government can do better? One big highlight is the Oregon Department of Economic Development, which is something like I don't have it with me, like $306 million. We zero funded that. We think that economic development should take place in the private sector. If communities need assistance in marketing their products, then they should go to the private sector. The Oregon Lottery, when they want to sell more tickets, they don't go to the Department of Economic Development, they go to an ad agency that knows how to make money. That's what our communities should do too.
Actually, the Oregon Department of Economic Development's money largely comes from the lottery.
That's right. Which doubles the irony, I think.
Okay, so that's one example of something you'd like to privatize. What are some of the other things you would want to put in the private sector?
Well, a lot of it has to do with functions. If you take a look at a lot of the various boards that are out there, particularly licensing boards, we don't want to eliminate state oversight, but the distribution of licenses, administration, proctoring tests, a lot of those functions can be privatized. We would privatize the Department of Motor Vehicles, and we would also favor the repeal of the Little-Davis-Bacon Act, which drives up the cost of maintaining and improving our transportation infrastructure.
And that's the one that requires that any money we collect from gas taxes has to be spent on roads?
No, that's the one that requires that construction workers be paid a union wage rather than the market wage.
Okay.
And this was considered in 1992, and it was estimated that the Little-Davis-Bacon Act adds 10 to 25% on the cost of public work projects, depending on the nature of the project at hand. So as we sit here and struggle with how to deal with our transportation system and the strain that it's under, this is an example right here. Now, some folks tell me, well, don't you favor living wage jobs? And the answer is, of course I do. And because I favor the market wage, unions see this as a threat, but it's really an opportunity. If we lower the cost of public works, particularly with regard to transportation, more of them will be commissioned, and unions will have a chance to recruit more employees into their ranks. I think any time you're paid less than the market says you're worth, it's dehumanizing. But if you force people to pay more than what the market says they're worth, you're dehumanizing the employer. And in this case, the employer is the people of Oregon.
That's such a sketchy thing, paying what the market's worth.
Right.
I mean, how do you define that? Farmers define paying what the market's worth as sometimes being less than the minimum wage, as we've been hearing in hearings recently in the state capitol. Certainly that's not something that people support. So how do you define paying what the market's worth?
I think it's an issue of supply and demand. One thing a lot of folks don't recognize is if someone is being subsidized, that money comes from someplace. You can point to the person the money goes to and say, look, we helped that person, there's a face, and it humanizes it. But the money that goes to subsidize that person comes from everywhere. It comes across the whole tax base. So it's very difficult to point to a face and say, this person's job was eliminated so that this person's job could be created. But in the large sketch, in the large picture, that's what happens, because government cannot create wealth. It can only redistribute wealth. And that is why we have to rely on the market as much as possible to make our economy go, because if we don't, we create distortions that ultimately go to hurt our economy.
So that's something that I've heard you speak about previously as well, that subsidies to businesses, subsidies to programs are not beneficial to the market. They're not something you support. You mentioned recently at a debate that you participated in with Governor Kitzhaber and Bill Sizemore and the Pacific Party candidate Blair Bobier, that one of the things that you don't favor are some of the tax giveaways, tax breaks that we give to corporations to come into Oregon. Talk about that.
That's right. Well, you know, we do a lot of corporate welfare, and actually the Oregon Department of Economic Development does do that. They help small businesses get rolling with loans or grants, and I don't think that's right. If you're going to be against government welfare, it has to be across the board, not just people, but corporations too. And I think that is what makes me different than a lot of so-called conservatives, because a lot of so-called conservatives will favor corporate welfare while being against the other kind.
Okay, so let's talk about welfare of the other kind. What is your perspective on what we do with poverty in Oregon?
Well, I think the best thing we can do is look toward our communities. I'd like to see us offer tax credits to people who offer donations to their local charities who provide relief for societies in distress, for families in distress.
But we do have that kind of thing.
We do have that now, but I think we can improve it by actually providing direct dollar-for-dollar tax credits. I also am a supporter of expanding the Jobs Plus program, which is used in the welfare system, and making it used more widely in the uninsurance division in lieu of unemployment checks.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because that kind of surprises me, given what you just said, that if you want to eliminate subsidies, you have to eliminate it across the board.
Right.
Jobs Plus is just a portion of our state's welfare reform process, and it actually only gets about 10% of the entire people who have gotten jobs. But it does it by subsidizing businesses.
It does it through a subsidy. When people are in distress and they're receiving subsidies, it's cruel to just take a meat cleaver and say, that's it, you're cut off. You need to provide an exit strategy, but it has to be an exit strategy. So I look at an incremental solution. The tax cut that I propose through my budget will inject money into a lot of these communities where they have high unemployment. Now, if we couple that with the Jobs Plus programs, we can create some economic activity in some of these towns that's going to generate some jobs. The reason why I don't object to Jobs Plus is because it doesn't go on forever. It has an exit strategy, and so over time you actually reduce the subsidies which take place, and people are left with private sector jobs.
But 90% of the people who are leaving welfare are getting private sector jobs or jobs with the state, but they're getting jobs without the state paying the employer to hire someone, which is what Jobs Plus does. It says, if you're an employer, I'll give you the money to hire this person over here. So why the emphasis on that particular program when the bulk of the people who are leaving welfare into jobs are getting it without that subsidy to businesses?
Well, what you're talking about is an effect that is intended with Jobs Plus. If you go and read a paper done by Bill Connerly, who's an associate of the Cascade Policy Institute, that's intentional. If you take somebody who's getting a welfare check or an unemployment insurance check, they are not going to look for work as earnestly as if they know that that's going to run out and they have to take a job.
But unemployment checks do run out.
They do run out, but when you attach work to it, there is an added incentive to go out there and actually find a job. And so some of these people get work through Jobs Plus, but some people just see these added incentives and go out and get a job. Now, in Eastern Oregon and Central Oregon, I think it's less of a factor because there's just a lot of poverty out there. You might be able to do that in Salem or Portland, where there's a lot of economic activity. But if you go down to Lakeview, there's not a lot of economic activity down there. And that's why I think you have to have a combined approach. You've got to put money into the communities, which my tax cut does, and then you have to turn that money into some economic activity, which I think Jobs Plus helps to get that rolling, helps to get that ball rolling.
Okay. Well, one last question along this line, because as a libertarian, you introduced yourself as someone that believes that government needs to get out of people's lives. But yet, what I hear you saying is that people who lose jobs and are thus eligible for unemployment insurance, what they need is government to give them an incentive to go find another job. Don't you think that's insulting? Don't you think that is putting government in people's lives?
I don't think it's insulting, and I think it is a way to in the long run, get government out of people's lives. Because if somebody is on welfare or somebody is on unemployment, that money has to come from someplace. And it comes from people who do have jobs and who are working hard. Yeah, and it comes the person who has been paying taxes. Mm-hmm. But that is, you have to ask yourself, a lot of that money, particularly for the social services, comes from people extracted forcibly through income tax or property tax. Now, I want government out of people's lives, and we need to have an exit strategy, an incremental strategy for doing that. But what I want to do is reduce the need to take money from people by force first, and then find an exit strategy to get people who are dependent on welfare and unemployment out. And it's a situation where government has contributed to part of the problem. You're not going to get out all at once. You're going to have to get out in stages, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now what you've also mentioned is in your budget, you talked about what you'd like to spend, what you don't want to spend. The budget is actually a two-part process now. You create the budget of what you are intending to do, basically policy-wise, what programs you're going to put money into and whatnot. There's also something called the tax expenditure report. Did you look at that, which was it's how much the state basically gives away in tax credits to people, and that amounts to more than we actually spend in the states. $15.8 billion we give away in tax credits to businesses and nonprofits. And have you looked at that? Have you looked for money in there that you can use as a governor to save expenses?
Well, we did look at that, and actually we're going to do more work on the budget because we want to take both the expenditure part and the revenue part and go to the legislature after the election and lobby for implementation. But at this phase, we've just completed the work on the expenditure side, and we wanted to show some savings. But as the campaign progresses, we'll have another release on the revenue side.
Okay. How do you differentiate yourself from some of the other candidates as well? One of the people that we've invited today, but unfortunately couldn't come, is Blair Bouvier. He is a candidate that's standing largely on a different kind of economic and environmental policies.
Right.
How do you see yourself in terms of your environmental policies?
Well, I think the biggest difference between Blair and myself is that I sort of have I think, a unique ideological point of view. I've got one foot planted in the conservative side, one foot planted in the more liberal side, whereas Blair is liberal plus. There are a lot of Democrats who have the same opinions that Blair has about the ecology and how to handle the ecology. And so the Pacific Party alternative, I think, is just a more distilled version of liberalism generally. And to other parties, I think that's more or less true as well, and that are more centrist. What makes us unique is we have a foot in both ideologies, making us unique.
But what kind of policies then would you push, promote, that would enhance our environment in Oregon? Governor Kitzhaber has been looking at Willamette River as a problem, water quality in many of our rivers across the state is a problem, salmon, obviously.
Right.
What kinds of policies have you been thinking about?
Well, I take a look at, let's start with, for example, the steelhead salmon, the salmon problems with the Columbia River and the problems there. This is a classic example of how the government gets you into a problem and can't get you out. You know, we've got these dams now which were heavily subsidized, and now a lot of these communities are addicted. They have to have the dams. I'm not going to tear down the dams and destroy these communities. A lot of them would be effectively destroyed if the dams were teared down. However, I would like to see things done. For example, I'd like to see the new turbines put in, which are supposed to kill fish or kill kill rates.
fewer fish.
Kill fewer fish.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. And also, I'm in favor of doing anything possible to help the salmon, short of destroying these communities. But one thing I want to mention is that we don't know everything that there is to know. I acknowledge that man has had an impact on the salmon and a lot of other species, but there are other factors to consider too. The 20-year warming cooling cycles, the El Nino effect, where ocean temperatures have gone up. These have hurt the salmon too. And you know, I was talking to, I don't recall his name, he's a dean of environmental law at Lewis and Clark College. And it's his opinion that these are huge factors in the salmon problem, and that it's presumptuous of us to think that we can master the system, and by simply tearing down dams we're going to solve problems that are often rooted in larger ecological venues or larger problems. So I guess the bottom line is I want to do what I can to help the salmon, but I'm not going to go so far as this.
What would that be? I mean, we're facing listings. We have the listing of the steelhead, potential listing, well, we have the listing of the coho now up and down the coast. So that means we have to take action.
And I will say this, I favor what Governor Kitzhaber has done with respect to the Oregon plan. Faced with the threat of federal intervention, which actually has happened because of the listing, I think that his plan is a good one, and I would agree with his decision to appeal that listing in the spring. Mm-hmm. And but I think as far as, you know, some of the things that are in the Oregon plan run counter to what I would like to do. However,
like what?
Well, I don't want to unduly restrict logging in some areas. I do not want to tear down dams. I do not want to destroy the infrastructure, but I understand that it's not entirely in the governor's hands or even in the state legislators' hands when you have that listing. So if we need to do this much to avoid the Congress becoming involved, I'm in favor of going that far.
I guess what I'm trying to get to, Richard, is that you're giving me some generalizations. Well, I'll do whatever I can short of taking down dams.
Well, yeah.
But what specifically would you do to make sure that we're doing things that benefit salmon? I mean, certainly we can talk about the fact that that oils from our city streets are getting into rivers, or municipal wastes, or pesticides.
This is what I mean when I say the government gets us in a problem and can't get us out. This is an intractable problem. If anyone comes up to you and says, I have the solution, they're not telling the truth. The only thing that I think could help would be to tear down all the dams, but I won't do that. You know, a lot of things have been tried. Hatcheries have been tried. The genetic quality of salmon coming out of hatcheries isn't as good as wild salmon. They've tried ladders. They've tried screens. Now there are new turbines. I favor all of those attempts and anything else that we might come up with in the future. But the fact is, nobody knows how to solve this problem. And I don't know how to solve it either.
Okay, let's talk about another problem, juvenile crime. The governor has come out with a strategy of putting something between the area of 30 million to 50 million into programs. And you've come up with a strategy as well.
Yeah, did you see?
Yes, I have, and that's why specifically I wanted to ask you about it.
Right.
Talk about the strategy. I think it's very unique.
The governor's solution is to just throw money at the problem. You know, I took a tour of the Washington County Jail, which is new, and I said, how many of these people are here not because of being high on substances or just robbing because they want the money? How many here are because of drug trafficking or trying to get money to buy drugs? And the deputy said almost all of them were there. And
with
what about
drug-related crimes?
Yeah, I mean, there are people who will rob a store and go out and buy a stereo because they want the money. But there are people who rob a store because they want to feed their drug habit. Or there'll be people who shoot others when a drug deal goes bad. I asked her how many of these crimes fall into that category. She said almost all of them. I said, is this true for juvenile crimes? Well, yes. And I used to work at...
Is it trafficking or just under the influence of these drugs?
Very few people commit crimes while they are under the influence of marijuana or heroin or these other crimes. Not that they're good. I'm not defending it. It's stupid to use drugs. But most of the crime is committed because of the black market drug trade. That's what causes neighborhoods to fall into decay. Gangs become powerful. They use drug money as an engine to fuel what they do. And the lure of big money causes otherwise good kids to come into the drug trade and get involved in that. This is the cause of juvenile crime. What Governor Kitzhaber is doing is just throwing money at it, treating the symptoms rather than the underlying cause. What I want to do is break the black market on drugs by shifting our laws away from regulating access to adults to regulating use. I would say that people who use drugs would be able to obtain them in pharmacies, which would also be a way to offer them help and ways to get off of drugs. But then you would have different kinds of drug laws. Minors wouldn't be able to use them. You couldn't use them in the presence of minors. Minors could not have them. You could not have them at schools. You could not have them at any public property or private property where the public can access, like shopping malls. And you could not drive or fly airplanes or operate machinery. You would have laws relating to drug use. That would protect society from drugs. But by not regulating access for adults, you break the black market. Because adults can get drugs from pharmacies instead of on the black market, it's less profitable to be involved in that black market. And you stiffen penalties for dealing to minors, selling to minors. So it no longer is profitable enough to take the chance on involving kids. It'll still happen from time to time, just like it does with beer and liquor now. But most of those problems will go away. Gangs will become disempowered because they won't have the money to fuel the level of activity that they can enjoy now. And it doesn't cost a cent. It saves money because you won't have as many prisons being filled up. You can take cops off the drug access beat and put them into the neighborhoods, protecting our homes, our schools, our families. And also with the tax cuts I'm proposing and the charter school plan that I've proposed, you're working at some of the other root causes of juvenile crime, that being financially unstable households, which cause a lot of marital discourse and sometimes divorces, and education. Everybody says that's an opportunity. It's not the whole solution.
So if I understand, if I can kind of put this in a little frame, you're saying that instead of spending $30 to $50 million, giving it to counties to address juvenile crime issues, targeting at-risk youth and with programs of one kind or another, you're saying instead eliminate laws that that prosecute people for the trafficking of drugs to adults, and use that money that you would save for education and for prosecuting people who would sell it to minors.
Yes, but also the need for crime prevention programs is less because fewer minors will get sucked into the black market drug trade. It won't be profitable enough to involve them for the risk.
Well, how is this idea being received? You've been around the state talking to people.
Well, most people, when they hear it, they think about it, and I've never had one person in this whole campaign tell me that it's crazy. They say that's unique, that's different. And there are people, even out in Eastern Oregon, which is extremely conservative, saying, that's a good idea. I've been saying that for years. And it just makes sense. John Kitzhaber wants to throw money at-risk youth. I want to remove the cause of the risk.
Now, you're saying the cause of the risk is purely drug-related.
Black market influences causing people to get involved with the drug culture and the black market culture.
But certainly we can look at a lot of other risk factors. Growing up in poverty is a risk factor relating to crime. Growing up in abusive households is a risk factor.
Right.
How does this plan address those things?
Well, like you said, by freeing up some of those resources. As far as poverty goes, if you provide a tax cut, you're going to help those marginal families. I think that will mainly benefit middle-class families who do pay taxes and would benefit from a cut, but whose finances are a little marginal and sometimes causes problems within the family. But with regard to the resources freed within the corrections institution, a lot of that can be applied toward helping families in distress. I'm not saying that the drug issue solves everything, but it frees up a lot of our time and a lot of our resources to address other causes.
One other arena that you have taken a more tolerant social position on is abortion and the right to die issues. So as a governor, then what would be your message to a Republican-held Senate that has repeatedly attempted to disembowel both of those laws in Oregon?
Well, I've noticed that one thing that Republicans respond well to is the idea of property rights. And if you go up to a conservative Republican and say, look, your body is the ultimate property right. If you cannot control yourself, what can you control? How can you control land? If you're in favor of property rights, who owns you? And that stops a lot of conservative Republicans dead in their tracks. They say, well, yeah, you know, and I think that creating that dilemma publicly would make it difficult for some of them to vote to overturn or try to overturn the assisted suicide law. As far as abortion goes, you know, something's offered to them too. I don't favor government funding of abortions at all. And I don't favor abortions during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. And I think that Senate Republicans are pragmatic enough to know that in a state like Oregon, that's about all they can hope for within the legislative process. Anything beyond that would have to be done through the initiative process, and you know, let them make their case. I don't think the people of Oregon will accept it, but that's what they can do. I can talk to conservative Republicans. I know a number of them who are in the legislature who've actually asked for my budget, including Brady Adams, and you know, they talk to libertarians well because we have things in common with them on finances. Same thing is true for Democrats with regard to civil liberties issues. And that's why if I were elected governor somehow, I would have a lot more flexibility than either John Kitzhaber or Bill Sizemore. Because, you know, the Republicans aren't going to forget that Kitzhaber vetoed 47 of their bills. They're not going to be anxious to give them any political victories. And Bill Sizemore, he is not popular, shall we say, and there will be a lot of folks in the legislature who won't want to give him political victories. I would not carry that baggage. I can talk to both. Start using the word tripartisan. Try on for size.
We've got about a minute left. I'd like you to just round up. You know, what are the last words you have for folks who are watching?
Well, all I would say is, look, this year the spoiler issue is not going to be a factor in this campaign. It's a good year to experiment, to vote for political innovation. I ask you to look at my voters pamphlet statement. You will not have to choose between your wallet and your personal freedoms, but I do favor those things that will protect your family, your homes, and your kids and your schools. I do want good education. I want tax relief. I think libertarian ideas have a lot to offer the people of Oregon. And what I'm trying to do with this campaign is show them what it's really all about.
Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Naseem.
We've been watching Salem. You've been watching Salem Week in Review. We've been actually doing Salem Week in Review. This is Richard Burke with Libertarian Party. I'm Naseem Rakka. We'll see you next week.